good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this long-awaited launch of a special issue being hosted by Social and Economic Studies called Emancipation Day Matters, Materiality and Cultural Contestation in the Caribbean. My name is Shani. I'm curator of the University of the West Indies Museum. And this special issue, which I'm so excited about, was really the result of effort during the pandemic to respond to what was really a tense cultural period. So I'm just going to show an image here very briefly. And this is some of the images that occurred during the pandemic. So the pandemic was, yes, a major health crisis. It was really a major period of major cultural change. And while people were demanding the removal of colonial era statues and monuments, in Jamaica, we had a survey about emancipation and Independence Day and merging them, doing away with the long weekend. And I felt that one of the things that we had to think about was Emancipation Day is important. It's ongoing because it's really a period of deconstructing societies that are grounded in histories of inequity. And the UWI Museum had three events. Emancipation Matters in Jamaica, Emancipation Matters in the English Caribbean, and in Emancipation Day Matters in the French, Spanish, and Dutch Caribbean. We also had two other programs titled Monuments in the Caribbean that really looked at cultural contested public sites and representation. So today we have my panelists are the co-authors who contributed coming out of that presentation, those presentations. And amazingly, we actually have presentations representing all the subregions in the Caribbean, Spanish, French, English, and Dutch Caribbean. And this is very exciting because Emancipation Day literature only focuses on the specific subregion. And now we've managed to pull all of them together. So my panelists, I'm not going to introduce them. I'll allow them to introduce themselves. And we're going to start with Rosemary Allen, Prof. Rose Allen, and then Prof. Cordero, Katarina Jacobson with Pierre Sainte-Luce, Candia, Mitchell Hall, and Lisa Tomlinson. And I'll allow them to introduce themselves. Each presenter has 5 minutes to provide a brief overview of their paper. And we're going to ask that ask your questions at the end of all the presentations, but you can also put your question in the chat. And that way I will also jump in and look at your question and ask our presenters. All right, the presentations will be occurring in English. You don't have simultaneous interpretation, but I'm so excited and I'm looking forward to our series today. And again, just thank you to Social and Economic Studies and Prof. Wall and his team to facilitate this. And Mary, who's the editor, which is very important, very patient with us. All right, I'm going to stop sharing screen and turn over to Rosemary, sorry. Prof. Allen.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Rosemary Allen, and I am a professor at the University of Curaçao. I'm also an anthropologist and with special interest in oral history. And in my article is titled A Perspective on Long Emancipation in the Dutch Caribbean, A View from the Margin. I explore the complex relationship between slavery abolition and the emancipation of the descendants of enslaved people in the Dutch Caribbean. And with the Dutch Caribbean, I mean the 6 islands, Curaçao, Aruba, and Bonaire, situated in the southern Caribbean, and St. Martin, St. Eustatius, and Ceiba, situated in the northeastern Caribbean. And slavery was abolished on these 6 islands on July the 1st, 1863. Some of the islands' economies were historically driven by urban commerce rather than by large-scale plantation-based agricultures. Others relied on small-scale plantation system for instance, for salt production. The Dutch Caribbean island offer a distinct perspective on slavery, abolition, and emancipation in the region. Their different economic, cultural, and political dynamics were influenced in part by their geography and climate. Instead of viewing emancipation as a singular event, I approach it as an ongoing journey. And I adopt Ira Berlin's concept of emancipation as a process of long duration, which began well before abolition of slavery and also extend far beyond it. Also, this journey has been propelled by the enslaved and their free descendants themselves and continues to shape the social, political, and economic landscape of these Caribbean territories today. Emancipation has unfolded across generations and has taken root in the experiences, resistance, and resilience of enslaved individuals and their descendants as they sought their rightful inclusion in society. A key element in my study is oral history, like I said before. Through oral histories, the lived experience of marginalized groups, and through them, the experience of their enslaved ancestor can be uncovered and recovered. In the traditional written records, their voices have often been erased, marginalized, or misrepresented. By using oral history, I bring forward both personal and collective narratives of those who lived through slavery, abolition, and emancipation. From the enslaved perspective, the fight for freedom began long before slavery abolition in 1863, as they had sought and actively pursued liberty. Their resistance to enslavement comprised both dramatic revolts such as the revolt of 1795 under the leadership of Tula, but it also comprised subtle everyday acts of defiance, such as fleeing, escaping. A very important example is that of Regina on Aruba, sabotaging equipment or withholding labor that gradually weakened the system. This small yet significant action helped cultivate a culture of resistance that later fueled more organized liberatory efforts. At the time of abolition, the celebration expressed in song, sung by the formerly enslaved people across the island, reflected their aspiration and vision of freedom. Freed people face systemic barriers to land ownership, and the educational system was not designed to stimulate empowerment. Notion of racial inequality remained deeply entrenched in post-abolition society and shaped legislation, rules, and social norms that governed the transition from slavery to freedom. The promise of freedom was therefore often seen as something illusionary, with freed individual remained second-class citizen. Despite the abolition of slavery, legal framework, exploited labor condition persisted. Many people chose to migrate temporarily or permanently to the mostly nearby Spanish territories, seeking to escape the harsh reality, but sometimes finding themselves in situations and conditions which were often not much better than those they left behind. The journey toward political empowerment and full citizenship in the Dutch Caribbean began in the 20th century, particularly with the introduction of general suffrage in 1948. And what is important also, you see, it also marked a progress in women inclusion in politics and society. A key milestone came in 1954 with the Charter of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, granting constitutional autonomy to the Netherlands Antilles, giving the island more self-governance and decision-making power. However, the islands continue to face the lasting effect of colonialism, including ethnic, racial, color, and class division that created barriers to full equality for descendants of the enslaved. And social tension led to labor protests, riots, and the social revolt of May 30, 1969 in Curaçao. You see also similar unrest occur on the other island, though to a lesser extent. The process of emancipation on this island were largely also driven by the desire to escape Curaçao political dominance and to achieve greater insular autonomy. While some groups in the Dutch Caribbean seek full independence, others aim for more greater political, economic, and cultural self-determination within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, striving for more equitable and respectful relationships. The emancipatory journey is not just about constitutional reform, but also about balancing self-government with social economic justice in a global world. So to finalize, the challenges faced by the Dutch Caribbean show that true emancipation is complex and certainly not linear. It involves political, economic, social, and cultural factors as the island continue to navigate the legacy of colonialism, racial and economic inequalities, social disparity, and unresolved cultural identity issue. This is, in short, due to the 5 minutes time allotted to me, the scope of my paper. Thank you very much and for your attention and for engaging with the idea I've presented. Thank you very much.
Prof. Juan, your turn. Unmute your mic. Yeah. You're muted. Prof. Juan and Rosemary. Yes, thanks.
There we go. Hello. I'm Juan Giusti-Cordero from Puerto Rico. I'm a retired history professor from the University of Puerto Rico, where I work mostly on Caribbean history in my graduate courses. Thanks for Dr. Shani Roper for inviting me to participate in the initial panel and then the special issue of social and economic studies, and for her leadership in bringing it to fruition. Thanks as well to Yan Shai, Mary Suen, Publications Officer of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute and the Managing Officer of the journal, for dealing, at least in my case, with several late edits. And thanks to the excellent reviewers whose observations greatly improved my paper. I am very pleased to publish in Social and Economic Studies, which is highly regarded in Puerto Rico, and which was a reference for me throughout my academic career, including the years I was associated with the Institute of Caribbean Studies, the companion institution to the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute, and which publishes Caribbean Studies. Of course, Arthur Lewis's work is forever associated with my country by way of his Puerto Rico-based economic model, a model that, as Vaughan Lewis and others have noted, has been too narrowly defined as simply a schema of industrialization by invitation. In Puerto Rico, the presentation of this issue of social and economic studies would have been part of Abolition Day commemorations, which every year center on March 22, next week, the date when the abolition law passed the Spanish Cortes. A Cumbre Afro or Afro Summit is being held next week for the fourth time since 2016, with a critical perspective that has broken with traditional commemorations of abolition. However, despite many advances in our historiography since the 1970s, major questions about abolition in Puerto Rico remain unaddressed. At the start of my research, I was intrigued by the differences in usage between abolition, universally employed in Puerto Rico to refer to juridical emancipation, and abolition in the Anglophone orbit, which refers in the first instance to the abolition of the slave trade. And this tends to invisibilize in the Spanish Caribbean the important struggles around the abolition of the slave trade. And we can go back to it in the questions if you're interested. The historical question I was drawn to initially was to compare emancipation in the Spanish Antilles with the English, French, and Dutch Caribbean. I soon realized that beyond differences in timing, the specific histories, as the question of terminology itself suggests, were quite different. So I settled on a comparison between the driving forces of emancipation in Cuba and Puerto Rico, which were both Spanish colonies at the time of emancipation, though they also differed in their processes. Cuba, to begin with, had a major insurrection in the 1870s, the 10 Years' War, and emancipation was almost a formality in 1880 when slavery was abolished in Cuba. In Puerto Rico, 1873. Then a question began to sneak in as a result of reparations initiatives in the Caribbean and beyond. Black Lives Matter, research in Britain around the post-slavery past of enslavers' capital, and the multiple initiatives in England and the US to eliminate or recite monuments, buildings, and landmarks that celebrated the memory of slaveholders and their political champions. Puerto Rico's abolition in 1873, which is, as I suggested, celebrated as being having a peaceful transition, the lesser discussed aspect of it was the compensation to the slaveholders. Were the enslavers in Puerto Rico compensated? I wasn't sure offhand, but soon found out that they were. I began to ask other historians, and either they didn't know, or they assumed that there was no payment, or that the amounts received were insignificant, or that the compensations were paid incompletely. And what about Cuba? The answers I got were similar. People were usually hadn't thought about it much. To my surprise, there was compensation in Puerto Rico. It was significant. It was paid in installments, and there was no compensation in Cuba. That really got me going. As I looked into the matter, I found that Puerto Rican historians, chiefly Lidio Cruz Monclova and Arturo Morales Carrion, and U.S. historians, chiefly Christopher Schmidt Noara, had looked at the process of slaveholder compensation. Another current, developed by Puerto Rican and Spanish economic historians, focused on the early history of banks and credit institutions in the island. A third current looked at memory and commemoration and monuments specifically on Ponce by the work of Margarita Flores, the late Margarita Flores, and Humberto Garcia Muñiz. It seemed important to connect these currents. I soon became convinced that compensation had laid the foundation for the island's strongly Spanish bank capital, with a trail that leads even beyond the US occupation and into the early 20th century. Now, that seems pretty far from my original mission to compare commemorations and the memory of emancipation, but the research turned the tables. Schmidt Noara's work again proved key, and I was suddenly confronted with the fact that the main monument of abolition in Ponce, El Parque de la Abolición, was promoted and partly financed by an enslaver/government official who played a key role in the enslaver compensation as well as in post-emancipation draconian labor policies. So I came full circle, just to show that the commemoration and memory is not just important as a historical question in itself, but how it can open seemingly different issues and approaches. My thanks for Social and Economic Studies for offering the opportunity to take this unforeseen and promising direction.
Thank you, Juan. Katarina and Pierre?
Hello. I'm Katarina Jacobson. I'm an archaeologist, director of the Museum Saint John Perse in Guadeloupe. And my co-author is Pierre Sainte-Luce, who is a doctor in medicine and sociology. And please excuse our French accent. Our article is named Commemorating the Abolition of Slavery in Guadeloupe and Martinique as part of the French nation. Our article explored the way in which Guadeloupe and Martinique commemorate the abolition of slavery, highlighting the resulting complexities of memory. Those territories, which became French department in 1946, are deeply marked by their colonial history and the lingering woes left by slavery. The celebration of abolition, far from being simple historical commemoration, are moments of vindication, resilience, and affirmation of a collective memory that sticks to exist beyond the French Republican framework. French colonization in the West Indies has shaped the history of Guadeloupe and Martinique for many years. After centuries of the slave trade, the first abolition of slavery was proclaimed in Guadeloupe in 1794, but re-established in 1802 by Napoleon Bonaparte. But just Guadeloupe had this first abolition, but not Martinique. It was not until 1848 that final abolition was decreed under the input of French abolitionists, but also thanks to the struggle of the enslaved people themselves. The date of commemoration reflects this tormented history. French officially recognized 10 May as the National Day of Commemoration because that was the day they decided that we had a French law recognizing slavery, crime against humanity. But in Guadeloupe and Martinique, other dates are preferred. The 27th of April for the promulgation of the abolition decree, the 22nd of May for the slave uprising in Martinique, and the 27th of May for the entry into force of abolition in Guadeloupe. This plurality of dates illustrates a competition of memories between the national narrative that highlight abolitionist figures such as Victor Schellcher and the local memory that value the resistance fighters. Beyond the date, the legacy of slavery is also psychological and transgenerational. Researchers such as Frantz Fanon and Aimé Charles Nicolas has shown that the descendants of enslaved carry within them the trauma of their ancestors, a phenomenon that science calls epigenetic inheritance. This collective suffering passed down through the generation makes commemoration not only moment of remembrance, but also space of healings. Here we'll continue.
Pierre, you have to unmute.
Yes, you can hear me now. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Pierre. I'm doctor in medicine and doctor in sociology. I am the owner of the house you have on the picture. It's a house plantation, the Holders plantation in Martinique, 1660. So I have to talk about resistance and contemporary struggles. The public space plays a fundamental role in the transmission of the memory of slavery. In Guadeloupe and Martinique, numerous monuments pay tribute to figures of the resistance. The statue of Louis Delgrès in Saint-Claude, it's a town. The Boulevard des Héros in Les Abymes, another town, with the statue of Solitude on Joseph Ignace. And we have also the Memorial Act. It's a museum in Pointe-à-Pitre, which has become the major place of reflection of the slave trade and its consequences. The monuments make it possible to give visibility to long-forgotten heroes while offering local populations place to reflect and reclaim their history. However, these representations are still a source of tension. While abolitionists such as Victor Schellcher, who is often portrayed as a savior of the slaves, are criticized. Some monuments were even torn down during social movements in 2020, illustrating a desire to put the struggles of the slaves back at the heart of the historical narrative. Moreover, civil society plays a crucial role in perpetuation of the living memory. Associations such as CM98 and Lamu Bayo organize commemorative marches, cultural events, and educational projects to raise awareness among the younger generations. These initiatives show that the memory of slavery is not limited to official ceremonies, but it carries by the descendants of the slaves themselves. who continue to fight for social justice and the recognition of reparation. The commemoration of the abolition of slavery in Guadeloupe and Martinique is a dynamic process marked by mourning, pride, and protest. The multiple dates, monuments, and citizen initiatives are all ways to resisting oblivion and fighting against the inequality period from the colonial period. Our article shows that these commemorations are not just tributes to the past, they are tools for the building of a fairer future.
Thank you so much, Pierre. Alessandra, I'll ask Pierre to repeat the name at the end of the presentations. All right, our next presenter is Candia.
Greetings, everyone. I am Candia Mitchell Hall, and I am a lecturer of culture and memory at the UWI campus. Just permit me to share my screen. I am also a Grenadian daughter of the soil, and which is my research focus on the title Jab Jab, the struggles for Black emancipation in Grenada. I am certainly excited to share tidbits of the paper that I finally produced and my research process with you. So last year, I revised an idea that I had concerning how Afro-Grenadians had commemorated emancipation. I wanted to understand whether Afro-Grenadians had used the performance to construct freedom and to contest inequality and injustice concerning emancipation. And it was bold, it was a frightening idea, especially because I had never read or considered how the mass of the people celebrated or contested their freedom across historical time. I was startled and I must say frightened by the possible answers that I found very quickly on. And I spoke to my colleagues and family about where the research was taking me, but the lead was too excited to turn back. So I decided not to turn back. Although most of the research that was out there on emancipation commemorations in Grenada provided the perspective of the elites and ignored the position of the people. There are works out there on emancipation commemoration on Grenada that would speak to how the British would use emancipation to frame abolitionist William Wilberforce as the hero of Black emancipation. So I spent weeks at a time wading through now new theoretical terrain, primary sources, old newspapers, conducting interviews in Grenada, doing social media interviews, reading articles on performance cultures as a source, and looking at secondary sources across the Caribbean, from Bridget Barrington to Marcia Burroughs to Barry Higman, and then, of course, to works on Grenada, and also speaking to the editor, Dr. Shani Roper, about where my research was taking me. What did I find out? I found out that Afro-Grenadians performed and re-performed acts of freedom and emancipation across historical time through Jab Jab. What is Jab Jab? It is a Black Grenadian cultural expression portrayed during Carnival in Grenada. And to perform Jab Jab, Grenadians oil down or bedab the entire body with a black substance comprising what is called old oil, made up of molasses, tar, charcoal, etc. The name Jab Jab itself comes from a derogatory term meaning diable, diable or devil, which the planters, I found out, would use to refer to the enslaved peoples and removed what they call the devil from within. So in their performance, Jab Jab would mock and satirize the planters and the elites as the real devils of their existence. So I entitled the paper Jab Jab, The Struggles for Black Emancipation in Grenada. And this is an image of Jab Jab. My central arguments are that Jab Jab is critical to understanding the struggles for true emancipation in Grenada in the past and the present, that too, Jab Jab intervenes during moments of extreme injustice and inequality, and that Jab Jab increases the grotesque nature of its resistance to comment on its dissatisfaction with the conditions in the society. I also found that the Jab Jab performance could provide a reparative framework to understand historical injustice. And in a few minutes, I'll share what I mean. The paper is divided into six sections and 5 moments of injustice in which Jab Jab would become more pronounced in their critique of the conditions in the society, their socioeconomic and economic and political conditions. So I'll just quickly cover the moments. The first moment is a moment of apprenticeship when emancipation was withheld. Afro-Grenadians did oil down B-dub in the black substance to protest the Apprenticeship Act. Secondly, they also contested the conditions of emancipation in 1838, which brought no material change to their socioeconomic conditions. They contested planter compensation. They lamented that they had not even been given a shilling or a square inch of land to help them construct freedom. And then the third moment I looked at was the ban on Jab Jab itself as obia, and also Jab Jab's comments on the poor economic conditions of the 20th century. I used a Jab chant, or what is called a Jab plea, called Pay the Jab Copper or Pay the Devil. And I found that it provides more than a literal reading of paying Jab Jab money or a copper. It does that too, but much more than that. But it speaks to paying him to return to place he considers as hell. And so in the paper, I argue that the Jab chant provides a reparative framework or ways in which the Jab Jab spoke about the injustices of emancipation that did not repair or reset the historical injustices of slavery and colonialism. Of course, I do not have a lot of time, and you have to promise to actually purchase the issue of this journal. But for the fourth moment, I go into comments on the role of Afro-Grenadians, who, of course, were not physically bedaubed in the blackness of Jab Jab, but as figures emerging from the Afro-Grenadian masses that they were obviously embodied. They embodied the blackness of Jab Jab as descendants, and they would rise to give voice to the struggle of the peoples. The final section would span the Grenada Revolution to the COVID-19 Cancellation Carnival August Celebration Act of 2020 and 2021. It is entitled Rememorizing Revolutionary Emancipation, and it argues that the birth of the Grenada Revolution would rememorize the resistance strategies of Jab Jab. And then it goes into the contestation of the recent COVID-19 Carnival Cancellation Act to show how those moments also recalled the memories of past historical moments, like the Fedawn Rebellion, the Grenada Revolution, and of course, the agency of the Afro-Grenadian peoples, Jab Jab, who would make statements about changing the political leadership of the nation. And we would see how that would manifest in 2022. And finally, I make some comments about Jab Jab in the Grenadian society. It is important for non-Jab Jab groups to understand the role of Jab Jab in intervening in moments of injustice and alienation, and the ways in which Jab Jab saved the mass of the people from social and political and economic death. Jab Jab is not the devil. It is a manifestation of injustice, and some apology or acknowledgement is owed to Jab Jab for struggling for true emancipation in Grenada in the past and in the present. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Candia. Okay, Lisa, it's your time to go.
Okay, I'm just going to share my slides and then do my intro. Second.
Full screen, Lisa.
Yep. All righty. All right. Good morning, colleagues and everyone. My name is Lisa Tomlinson. I'm the senior lecturer and head of department for the Literatures and English department at UE, University of the West Indies, Mona campus. I just want to say thank you to Shani for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. My discussion is very literary, and I oftentimes find that in the discussion around colonialism, emancipation, it's very historical in nature, geographical. So literature oftentimes gets disconnected from discussion around or, conversations within emancipation. My paper entitled Emancipation in Anglophone Caribbean Literature, looking at Annie John and White Sargasso Sea. So I'm going to just go to the first. So what this paper does, it more or less, it explores the representation, how colonialism, because we can't separate the two. So how colonial periods and emancipations, how they're represented in Caribbean literature. And in doing that, I look at two authors and how they depict these historical moments. So I look at it within a historical context. So since Caribbean literature in nature is very historical, this is how I came to the Caribbean in terms of understanding the Caribbean. The different Caribbean is through literature in terms of the history. So I drew on Craig Lucas, the historical novel, to contextualize the selected works. So in this case, what the paper does, it gives a historical narratives of how the characters struggle with the concept of emancipation. And I look at White Sargasso Sea, in the sense that it is set in the aftermath of the Emancipation Act of 1833, and it engages deeply with the connections or the ways in which the characters, not just the human characters, but even the setting plays a role as a character, because again, we see what the aftermath of emancipation has left behind within this Caribbean space. And we're talking Jamaica particularly because this is where the story takes place. So we're looking at White Sargasso Sea. I explore the Creole characters, particularly the white Creole characters. Another, I think, unique aspect of the research is because we hardly really talk about white Creole characters in the struggle or in the conversations around emancipation. So I look at the white Creole characters and how they have attempted to redefine themselves, and this is again, the redefining themselves within the post-emancipation period, because the characters have lost economic status. The white Caribbean, the white Creole characters have lost economic status, and in doing so, they have to now re-navigate these spaces. And also, another text that I look at, or the only text that I look at, again, beside White Sargasso Sea, is Annie John. And I look at Annie John because, again, Jamaica Kincaid, her book, what it does, it looks at colonialism and emancipation and how the characters, it's very complex ways of how the characters contend with freedom. So while we're looking at Antigua, the setting, and it's an independence, there's still niggling issues of the freedom. And so we see this emancipation being sought through the main character, Annie John, who uses this opportunity to reject this colonial, legacy that has been left behind through education. So again, not so much of just the colonialism, but the ways in which the education itself is not emancipated because she's not learning about herself. So she uses the opportunity, for example, to reject for Christopher Columbus, we know, who is said to have discovered the Caribbean. But she uses this opportunity to emancipate herself and her classmate to challenge her teacher in spreading supposedly this propaganda. So in doing this historical novel of Gregory Lucas, it really helps to frame the work by closely examining how the characters, and as I said before as well, how the settings in this section does act as a character, because again, the characters are interacting with the environment, and how these aftermath and these remnants of emancipation lingers. And then I also couple this because I found that looking at it, Greg Lucas' historical novel wasn't enough. I included Edward Glissant's prophetic vision of the past. And the reason why I combine these two together is because a close reading of Edward Glissant's concept would show that he urges, in fact, he encourages writers to use the novel as a means of integrating or engaging with trauma of colonial displacement. So unlike the historical novel that I use as well to frame the work, Glissant's work becomes very useful because he's not just concerned with the historical moment. He's not just concerned with emancipation as a historical event or as a documentation, as a record. He's concerned with how the writers use this prophetic, this idea, the prophetic vision in the past. He's concerned with how they use it as a way to deal with the traumas. And we see throughout the novel, for example, in going back to White Sargasso Sea, the key character finds herself trapped within the complexities of going between these different identities, the Black and white identities. So she straddles within a British and a Black or white population. And she's also very isolated. And again, this past experience or memory of her now becomes situated within the present. Likewise, as I noted, Annie John's colonial education demonstrates not just the effects as we would look at the historical period of emancipation, but now she's also grappling, and the nations, right? They're grappling with this idea of independence and how emancipated is a society. So we see how she, as I mentioned earlier, how she rejects the colonial education, how she challenges her teacher's example of Christopher Columbus. So again, this reads very well into the prophetic vision of the past, which Edward Glissant proposes. So in conclusion, what more or less the paper does, it examines close reading of both authors to show how history and personal memory help to shape the Caribbean narratives. They balance, the paper balances Lucas's framework, highlighting historical events, in this case, emancipation and colonial exploitation through the eyes of the ordinary people, because that's another thing with Lucas' idea of the historical novel. They're using his very normal, not noble figures that we usually see in the original historical novels, where they're, kings and queens taking part in history. These are just the ordinary. So what this paper does is foreground this with not just the historical novel framework, but we're also bringing in Glissant's work. And by doing so, Kincaid and Rees, Jean Rees, they do more than just tell us, recount historical events, but they also show in a very real way, they show how these events remain in the memories of Caribbean people. So unlike, again, the way we perceive history, or not history, excuse me, literature to be as just very abstract, in a very real way, the authors are able to use the lived experiences of Caribbean people, the memory, to document in a very historical way, document emancipation and colonial exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I just want to thank everyone here on the panel. I believe that these presentations have really broadened our understanding of emancipation, not just emancipation as a historical moment, but emancipation as figuratively, as well as emancipation across the region. I mean, one of the issues with Caribbeanness is that there are many Caribbeans with a shared history and legacy, but our realities are really different, and there are different factors that shape how we commemorate emancipation. So while I'm waiting to see if anyone has any comments or questions, I want to ask two questions. The first is to Rosemary. You in your paper, you use a lot of the oral histories to talk about the ways in which persons in the early to mid 20th century, I believe, talk about emancipation, and as well as their life navigating the Caribbean. So I know a lot of your work is in Curaçao, is that correct? So what does that oral archive look like? And what do we stand to gain by engaging oral archives, whether they're recordings of songs or interviews? What do we stand to gain when we rethink contemporary societies, especially the Dutch Caribbean, that is, it's these six islands with a different kind of history of enslavement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. And indeed, I've done oral history not only in Curaçao but also on the other islands as well. And what the oral histories have learned me is that it gives insight into how people think about their situation. Because most of the time, when you're looking at the written document, there's very little information with regards to social, immaterial aspects with regards to the enslaved and their descendants. When do you see much information being given? When, for example, they are forming a threat to the establishment. You see that that much information is given, much data is given with regards to what the enslaved are doing. And an example is that, for example, the 1795 uprising of enslaved along Curaçao, you see there is much information with regards to why the people were doing it, because a Dutch priest was sent to the enslaved to talk with them. And they later interviewed the Dutch priest and transcribed what he said and in the archives. So through oral history, I've been able to get a different insight into the history of people, in particular the enslaved. And it gives so interesting information, because if you look only at the written document, you will get a wrong idea of how the people live and how they thought about their situation and the circumstances they live in. So oral history have helped me to look more in depth and look at their situation and the circumstances they live in and how they thought about their circumstances in a more elaborate and more in-depth way.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. Juan, so my question for you also has to do with so you in your article you note the differences in the ways in which the histories are around compensation and emancipation abolition happens between Cuba and Puerto Rico. But given the current, I know that there's about to be a press conference in April around the second International Decade for People of African Descent. Has there been more discussion in a contemporary context about questions of reparations around the compensation? Because a lot of that happens in the English Caribbean, represented in the Puerto Rico context. You have to unmute.
Okay. No, there hasn't been that discussion. I want to get my article translated into Spanish, as soon as possible, because in English it circulates in a limited way. People read it, but it gets more mileage in Spanish. No, I've asked fellow historians, was there compensation? And oh, no, there wasn't, or there was very little, or whatever. So there's a great deal of ignorance and indifference. And I think, yeah, it is very important to bring it up in this context, which is a very favorable one for the discussion. And it also connects us with the English and Francophone and Dutch Caribbean in ways that are so important. Cuba, there was no compensation, so that's part of the reason, perhaps, why the issue has not did not have more traction in Cuba. There were 200,000 slaves, so discussing compensation was out of the question for Spain. There was not. In Puerto Rico, it was about 12,000 enslaved, as I recall. And they were able to manage very orderly kind of and paying at good prices, as the article notes. They paid somewhat higher than average, higher than average than that of the market price at the time, which I was really surprised to find out. Some of the money got lost in the process and so forth, but there was a substantial amount that did get paid. So, but in Cuba, it was the enslaved population was so large, and also the war was breaking out. The 10 years war was breaking out, and the conditions of the country it made it more difficult for full transition from slavery. But the biggest issue was the number of slaves. So in Puerto Rico, yeah, we need the discussion, and hopefully publication in the social and economic studies gives it a visibility that helps a lot. Sometimes we need to hear things from the outside to listen to them more closely, and publication in Jamaica surely will help a lot.
Oh, absolutely. And I guess we'd have to also talk to Suen about the publication, translating the article to Spanish and circulating, right? So I have a follow-up. So we don't have that much time, but I do have a question for each of my colleagues, because for Katarina and Pierre, it is that there is a changing social cultural moment in the French Caribbean, I think. And how has this impacted um the, there's a consistent commemorative process. What I wanted to be clear is if it's more proactive in Guadeloupe as opposed to Martinique, and if in and going forward, do you see an increased commitment to centering the Afro-French commemorative practices as over the national practices, or are they going to continue to exist in tandem fairly equally? I mean, either Katarina or Pierre could answer that.
I think we have big issue in the French Caribbean because this system will not change. We are making small steps, and now more and more the national the France in the mainland is starting to listen to the French island, and understanding that we want this national representation with this diversity. But we still have a ministry of the overseas department. Like before, this ministry was the Ministry of the Colonial States. Then if we want to improve things, it will take a long time. But for now, the best thing for us is to maybe try to organize in each island this kind of representation of those local heroes and try to erase this history of the white supremacy sovereign French. And if we start in this way, we will be stronger to speak to the mainland.
Yes, but because descendant of slavery like me became to have different things in the Caribbean, like you see the plantation. It's an important level to discuss with the French in Europe. For example, in 1 month, the Minister of Tourism will be in Seychelles in Martinique. It take place the monument that is behind me, and we'll have the opportunity probably with Katarina to discuss with this Minister of Tourism to talk about difficult things like, for example, reparation. So I think that is important to be there with she to discuss. They asked me today to put the habitation for a conference for the Ministry of Tourism. So we will talk. And I think that it's important to be there.
Right. Yes, those opportunities are still important. I think this is a struggle with memorial, the memorial component of emancipation and the long-term socioeconomic implications and re-education of the population, that the tension that we're constantly playing with the economic system. I think it's very important. Okay, so for Candia, you and I had some very long discussions about the reframing of the paper and how to navigate the question of jab jab. For you as a cultural scholar, um, what what additional interventions are there to be made when we think about carnival, right? So and I think Trinidadian carnival gets probably the most literature attached to it, but the intervention with jab jab um is integral because then it brings our days of regional performances away from the power of the Trinidadian carnival to thinking about culture and emancipation in different ways. So please give me some of your feedback there.
Well, great question, Shani. And yes, we had a lot of conversations back and forth to arrive at Jab Jab. I think one of the most critical intervention would have to be at the state level. We saw with the new political power taking over the National Democratic Congress, the Prime Minister himself enrobed in Jab Jab. The first time he appeared at Carnival in 2022. And for many Grenadians, it was an acknowledgement that he would present himself within the stories of Jab Jab as a figure who was alienated, himself as a descendant of Afro-Grenadians, as an Afro-Grenadian himself. So I think that that kind of political statement might have said to the nation that there is a new way in which cultural expressions in Grenada is being seen and reclaimed as part of an understanding that they are part of the conversation of national development, social development, a way of historicizing, rehistoricizing, and decolonizing narratives concerning cultural expressions that were demonized during European colonization, like Jab Jab, which is still today very much contested. I did some social media questionnaires using Facebook and so on. And I found that Grenadians are split on the question of Jab Jab. And that is because of our colonial inheritances, that we are told that Jab Jab means the literal translation of acting like the devil. That it and so it would have to be part of a reparative conversation. How do we repair some of these narratives that have been constructed around Black cultural expressions? Jab Jab would have to take center stage because it is the blackest. Jab Jab makes a deliberate attempt to blacken physically, socially, and to portray badness. Badness, but in a sense to say, we wish to reclaim, we wish to make statements about our injustices and our inequalities. It is not well understood. There will have to be a mass rehistoricization program, conscientizing the people, using social media, using education, perhaps even revising our education, our school curricula to include Jab Jab as an expression of emancipation, as an expression speaking to how the people have struggled for emancipation and rejected the emancipation that they were offered with no material change to their conditions, with poor socioeconomic conditions, with no education, with not even a piece of land, etc., etc. So I think that Jab Jab and Black cultural expressions itself would have to take center stage to rephrase, to reset thinking, to reclaim, and to re-envision how we understand performance of the peoples across time and space, to make comments, to criticize their own conditions in the society. And it would have to be a sustained effort. It cannot be one that begins today and ends tomorrow. And it would have to include a multiplicity of stakeholders, from Jab Jab promoters, who I also interviewed, to Jab Jab practitioners, to those who may wish to understand the deeper cultural and historical significance of Jab Jab, university students, students who are at primary school who also participate in Jab Jab, women in the society. So we would have to start to use Jab Jab as a source of information to speak about the becoming self of Grenadianness and our Caribbeanness at large as people who carved out freedom through resistance, essentially.
Right. Thank you so much. All right. So we have a question here from Akama. Akama, let me see if you can unmute. Can you unmute? Yeah, so go ahead, Kama. You can just ask your question, comment briefly, quickly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Okama Ekbe Brook. Actually, Ekbe is Nigerian, and Ekbe people are represented around the world. We're in Cuba, we're in Grenada, we're in the US, we're, all around. And my grandmother was Obia. We spell Obia, O-B-I-A. I know that Obia in the Caribbean context is spelled differently, and it has a negative, devilish connotation. I say this as a pretext to my commentary, which is that the arts, creativity, music, social commentary, dance is very much a part and parcel of who we are as Africans, people of African descent. I grew up with music in my life, drums. Every time there's a celebration, we have that. And people tell stories of our livelihoods, our lifestyles, through the sound of the drums, through, the oral music. And when we dance, we express our feelings. And the way we dress to, dance to perform the music is an expression of, the joy or the trauma or, whatever we're feeling. That is our expression. And that is why the Africans are always so happy people. And we celebrate a bountiful harvest through, the New Yam Festival in Nigeria. And it's an ongoing thing. However, when the colonizers came with religion, the goal of religion was to wipe away whatever ancestral history there was and tell the one land story through the Bible. And that attempt tried to wipe out everything that we have. But we persevered, and the celebrations continue. So I was perplexed in my experience living in the Dutch part of the Caribbean, in Curaçao, and then eventually in St. Martin. I was perplexed with how emancipation celebrations were done. and very negatively perceived. But I believe that part of it is trying to tell the story of freedom, and the way that people dress is to express their body positivity, their feelings, and that release from the trauma of enslavement. And so going to the second decade, you mentioned about the second decade for people of African descent, and even the fourth forum taking place in New York in April. I think the whole conversation around reparations needs to look at not just the apology, but ways to do more research and sharing of that research. Because people are afraid of that which they do not know, but which is expressed through our celebrations. I would stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Akamo. Well, just to say, I think the Caribbean, broadly speaking, the Caribbean context is very, very complex because of the legacy of enslavement, as well as the ways in which Caribbean nationhood is constructed. And in many ways, the tension is often becomes Black anti-Black, right? And there are many ways that we are constantly at war with ourselves. So I think a lot of the work that this special issue, for example, is trying to do is to open up that discussion, but to make it multidimensional. One of the problems with just focusing in the English Caribbean is that you only speak about the English Caribbean context. But what this special issue does, it says it's a Caribbean issue, and it's an issue that transcends language, but is shaped by the complexity of our socioeconomic and cultural context. Helen, please go ahead, and then I'll ask Lisa a question. Go ahead, Kellyanne, if you can unmute.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Katarina, and I am a teacher from Grenada. Now, I must say thank you to my friend, Miss Candia Hall, for inviting me to this meeting, because we would have had conversations back and forth, because I like history, and she likes history as well. But I must say that, going back to what you said about Carnival in Trinidad, we had a representation this year. This year, we had a representation from our Jab Jab, a small portion of our Jab Jab going down to Trinidad, and that made a statement in itself. That I was tuning in. Of course, I wasn't able to go, but I was tuning in, and it's really stated that Jab Jab is not just literal devil, but morning, it's just to say that that's emancipation feeling, and the Trinidadians welcome it so much. And of course, back home, there still needs to, as Candy said, there still needs to be more education. Of course, from our present government, the education has started. Our carnival, the Grenada Carnival Corporation is trying to do a lot of education where that is concerned. So I believe that we just need to get our teachers on board, our parents on board, because school teacher, you would hear parents say, oh, it's devil thing, it's devil, so you don't teach your children that. But more needs, I believe that with more education needs to take place. As I said, it has started, and we definitely will continue together and to get everybody on board, including our Ministry of Education, to be the driving force to really push through emancipation. And another thing I must say, in terms of our history, we have started it, which are elated about, whereby the Dr. Nicole Phillip, my sister, recently did our history books, and it has been, and it is in schools right now. So it's just to get teachers on board to teach our Grenadian history. our emancipation history, our Caribbean history, and push it as a driving so that our children, our generation, and beyond, and our future generation can truly understand the true meaning of emancipation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your feedback, Kellyanne. All right, I have my last question for Lisa, and then we're going to wrap up because not advised to do Zoom meetings for too long, beyond an hour. So Lisa, my question to you is this. So I've always believed that literature has a kind of power, creative power and freedom that historians don't have. We can't make up history, right? We have to be constantly guided by the archive. And for you, in terms of as a specialist and doing this work, thinking through emancipation, uh, do you believe that there is so much more creative work to be done about rethinking emancipation, or has literature been funneled in a particular way and this opens the door thinking more about others, or do we need to put more historical events out there that would feed creativity? I'd love your feedback on this.
Yeah, I definitely think we in the Caribbean, we have so much creative work that are already doing the job in terms of emancipation, talking about it, bringing light to emancipation, colonialism. As Candia was talking about in terms of the curriculum, I think we need to appreciate creative work more. I think we tend to delegitimize creativity as abstract or just for fun. So within the case of the jab jab, there's that historical significance taken out of it because it's just seen as a festival, as just a holiday. Likewise, going back to literature, we look at literature as just something that you pass. We're not taking out the history. And you're so right in terms of the liberty that the literary texts have in terms of how they can reshape the way we think about literature. Because when you look at the two books, the novels that I looked at, they're also bringing in gender perspective and how women who are often omitted from discussion around emancipation. It's always when we talk about emancipation, we focus on men. So I think creative work like literature, they bring a very multifaceted of lived experiences. And these lived experiences, and that is why I brought in Glisson's work about how urging writers to use their literary platform, creative platform, because not just to put in a novel, could be in poetry, orality, because that's a part of literature, using this platform as a way to speak to the trauma, to speak to the different ways in which we engage literature in history. Because I find very quickly, historians, we will look at it, and this is not to blight historians because we're all needed in an interdisciplinary way. But when we look at it in a historical way, factual way, it's just an event. We tend to focus on the events. Whereas the creativity allows us to kind of, because even I mentioned in terms of the setting itself becomes a character. So we now understand, like for example, in the classroom in Annie John, where the setting becomes very important because that is where she has to negotiate how free or independent is Antigua when we have a curriculum that is still teaching us about, in the case of Annie John, teaching about Christopher Columbus. So we're able to kind of manipulate those types of setting and making the setting highlighting as a part of our everyday life, our interaction, not just this is where it took place or this is the time period, but a more interactive way. So I think creative expressions like literature plays a very important role in this conversation. And that is why I thanked you at the beginning, because oftentimes literature is just seen, or music, it's just jab, just seen as just an aside. It's very abstract. How does that relate to us? But it does, because it formulates a historical text. I could see it as a historical text, and that is also why I use the historical novel as a framework.
All right, thank you so much, Lisa. Colleagues, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. My hope is that persons will engage this special issue, see it as a useful for teaching, for thinking about the Caribbean in a very broad way and in a multidimensional way, and also to see that it is possible that while someone is a specialist in the field, that a companion article that's in a totally different field works to present a multidisciplinary perspective about this space that we live and occupy I want to say special thanks to Yan Chi Suen, who is the editor at Social and Economic Studies. This special issue took 3 years. And it required a lot of patience and navigating complexities of life and authorship. I want to thank my authors. Some of you were a little bit more, a little bit more patient as the rest of us worked through some of the nuances of the articles. I want to thank the reviewers. I think the reviewers' feedback went a long way to strengthening each of the articles here. And also I want to thank my colleagues because it was also a learning experience for me because I am pro-Caribbean, but for me, it has also been a really important learning experience. We all come from a similar historical context, but geography, language, demography, the post-independence moment makes everything much more complicated. And I really just appreciate all my colleagues for taking time to also be willing to share and educate me as well about the nuances in our history and why it's so important to be regional in our perspective when we talk about the Caribbean. Great. Okay, thank everyone. I want to thank our attendees as well. I want to thank you for the comments. We've had a very active chat. And thank you so much for the feedback and your comments really affirm how important it is to have a special issue like this. So I want to just express, gratefulness, gratitude, thankfulness to everyone here. My colleagues who've been busy and running before, thank you so much for being present and trying as much as possible to stick to the time. 5 minutes is not a long time for academics. It's very painful. So thank you very much for sticking to the time. And thank you so much for delivering and staying with the special issue. And thank you to everybody and the Institute, Sir Arthur Lewis Institute, and the Social and Economic Studies team. Thank you so much.